I'd like to welcome everyone here this afternoon to this special event. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College here at Middle Tennessee State University. And on behalf of our college and Dean Weil, I welcome all of you here today. As you may know, this is the second part of a larger event. We had to cancel the original event because of weather conditions, and we rescheduled both parts at different times. Today's program focuses on Poe and the universe, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome our speakers today. We're going to have two speakers followed by a discussion at the end, and we'll have a respondent. So with that, I'd like to begin first by welcoming our first speaker. Dr. William Engel is the Nick B. Williams Distinguished Professor of Literature at Sewanee, the University of the South. He serves as a member at large of the Poe Studies Association Executive Committee. In addition to publishing chapters and volumes on literary studies, he has authored 5 books on intellectual history and visual culture, including Early Modern Poetics in Melville and Poe, Memory, Melancholy, and the Emblematic Tradition, which was named a Literary Essentials title. He's currently co-editing for Cambridge University Press, The Art of Memory, a critical anthology. His remarks today are drawn from his most recent work on Poe, which will eventually appear as a chapter in a projected book called Poe and Place. His presentation today is titled Angelic Places in Poe's Work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Engel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phillips, for the invitation and rescheduling and pulling all this together. And also, I'd like to thank Dean Weil for all of his good ministrations. There's a handout coming around, and the aforementioned book on Poe and stuff to occupy your time, because I won't be reading all of the long poems that are here. Some of you will be familiar with them, some of you will not. But I'm going to start with one that is pretty familiar. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more." Distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. Everybody should have the handout, and you should probably know that poem, many of you from memory, I would hope. And I want to call attention to the end of that second stanza of this poem, The Raven, whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. The departed Lenore is named or addressed by the angels, not here, but there. And where is there? She may no longer be of this world, but where exactly are these angels naming, calling to Lenore? Angels in Poe are not traditional Judeo-Christian choirs of angels with harps and hosannas. What region then do they inhabit? And what about their ontic status, their being? Several clues come from the colloquy between the fledgling Oinos and the wizened Agathos in The Power of Words, written by Poe. Clearly, from this passage, angels' age in Poe figured as celestial, weirdly disembodied entities, still having the means to speak, more evolved versions of mortals with recollections of the mundane world they've left. They're shown as continuing to mature and gain knowledge as the aeons roll on and time unfurls. And here I'm going to call upon my friend and colleague, Professor Hal Poe, who is a world expert on Eureka and indeed Poe's angels and other things. We'll be reading The Fledgling.
Pardon, Agathos, the weakness of a spirit new-fledged with immortality.
You have spoken nothing, my Onos, for which pardon is to be demanded. Not even here is knowledge a thing of intuition. For wisdom, ask of the angels freely, that it may be given.
But in this existence, I dreamed that I should be at once cognizant of all things, and thus at once happy in being cognizant of all things.
Not in knowledge is happiness, but in the acquisition of knowledge. In forever knowing, we are forever blessed. But to know all were the curse of a fiend.
But does not the Most High know all?
That, since he is the Most High, must be still the one thing unknown even to him.
But since we grow hourly in knowledge, must not at last all things be known?
Look down into the abysmal distances. Attempt to force the gaze down the multitudinous vistas of the stars as we sweep slowly through them, thus, and thus, and thus. Even the spiritual vision, is it not at all points arrested by the continuous golden walls of the universe? The walls of the myriads of the shining bodies that mere number has appeared to blend into unity?
I clearly perceive that the infinity of matter is no dream.
There are no dreams in Aden, but it is here whispered that of this infinity of matter, the sole purpose is to afford infinite springs at which the soul may allay the thirst to know, which is forever unquenchable within it, since to quench it would be to extinguish the soul's self. Question me then, my Oinos, freely and without fear. Come, we will leave to the left the loud harmony of the Pleiades and swoop outward from the throne into the starry meadows beyond Orion, where, for pansies and violets and heartsease, are the beds of the triplicate and triple-tinted suns.
And now, Agathos, as we proceed, instruct me. Speak to me in the earth's familiar tones. I understand not what you hinted to me just now, of the modes or of the methods of what, during mortality, we were accustomed to call creation. Do you mean to say that the Creator is not God?
I mean to say that the deity does not create.
Explain.
In the beginning only, he created the seeming creatures which are now, throughout the universe, so perpetually springing into being, can only be considered as the mediate or indirect, not as the direct or immediate results of the divine creative power.
Among men, my Agathos, this idea would be considered heretical in the extreme.
Among angels, my Onos, it is seen to be simply true. Thank you so much. I could just imagine Poe saying that, this wonderful colloquy. So, among the angels, it is a given. It's simply true that their coming into being is an indirect cause of the divine creative power, and that creation is ongoing. Poe will develop this notion throughout his career, early and late, from the time of his penning Al-Araf, 1829, when he was 20. Some of y'all are 20. What have you written lately? To his magnum opus, Eureka, posthumously published finally in 1848 and existing in several manuscripts with annotations. A topic for another day, and indeed one on which I would recommend to you Professor Poe's work. In Al-Araf, angel-like beings, especially the maiden angel, Ianthe, and her seraph lover, Angelo, are of principal interest to us today. For as Poe explained in a letter to a publisher, reprinted by Harry Lee Poe in his illustrated companion to Poe's Telltale Stories, 2008, page 39, Al-Araf of the Arabians is a medium between heaven and hell, where men suffer no punishment, but yet do not attain that tranquil and even happiness which they suppose to be the characteristics of heavenly enjoyment. And from where do they hail? From a supernova or shooting star in the cluster of Cassiopeia, discovered by Tycho Brahe, as a prefatory note and later edition suggests. Somewhere in the cosmos, yes, but decisively not of this world, indeed absolutely otherworldly, though beauty in our world derives from this very tutelary spirit named by Poe, Nasake, an ethereal personification of beauty incarnate, washing herself, lathing in the cosmic elements, as did Diana in her Arcadian pool. I'd call your attention on the longer handout to a passage I wish I had time to read from Al-Araf, where many of the same aspects of celestial, when I say celestial, I mean stars are up there in the constellations from Cassiopeia and on down. So that's the second page from Al-Araf. This strange Neoplatonic vision of the spirits becoming stars from the classical notion of stellification, the celestial spheres harmonizing with one another, yon world afar, afar, and opening onto a world of seemingly multiple worlds, is animated by beauty of an ethereal order, which emanates from thence into our realm, where we too can catch a glimpse and hear its harmonic strains. This is a matter for poetry, these harmonic strains. Indeed, Poe makes it the province of the celestial poet and the principal subject of poetry itself, and of his own poetry in particular. For example, in his Quranic-inspired view of the heavenly lyricist Israfel, we have a description of a place positively not here, such that the poet imagines changing places with the angelic singer, giving voice to tunes sung wildly well. And here I call attention to the 1845 to 48 version of Israfel. It's a short poem. I wish I had time to read it all, but I'll just indicate that here again we have the rapid Pleiades, which we saw earlier in the section of the dialogue that Professor Poe and I read. And I will, however, read the last two stanzas to drive this point home. Yes, heaven is thine, but this is a world of sweets and sours. This world here, says our narrator poet of Israfel, whose heartstrings are a lute, none sings so wildly well as the angel Israfel. Our flowers are merely flowers, and the shadow of thy perfect bliss is the sunshine of ours. If I could dwell where Israfel hath dwelt, and he where I, he might not sing so wildly well a mortal melody, while a bolder note than this might swell from my lyre within the sky. Appended as a footnote in some versions of this poem and prefacing it as an epigraph in other later reprintings, we're informed explicitly that, according to the Quran, and the angel Israfel, whose heartstrings are a lute, and who has the sweetest voice of all God's creatures. This angel dwells in heaven, but it is an Islamically nuanced one, ever so slightly different from and yet decisively not the Judeo-Christian one. However, Israfel, in the Islamic tradition known as the Burning One, is one of the four archangels in Islamic tradition. He's not mentioned, however, directly in the Quran, though his presence is implied from verses concerning the final blast of the trumpet at the end of days, bringing him in line with Raphael in the Judeo-Christian version. And later, of course, Gabriel and the horn in the Christian tradition. But that Poe chose Israfel and not Raphael and not Gabriel is precisely the point. This angel, Israfel, causes us to think outside the limits of how we in the West, in the Anglo-American tradition, have come to imagine angels. Poe would have his angels tenuously conceived and just out of reach of our usual conceptualization. Hence the disparate merging of cosmologies, as we've seen variously in the cosmic nursery from the early poem, the Neoplatonic spheres within spheres that we saw in the other. And I just broke things with batteries, and I do that a lot. So I'm going to put this here, and we'll put batteries back in a moment. Poe sees them as stellified spirits, new-fledged with immortality, and an oriental inflected heaven among the stars and above the earth. Israfel is so near the Pleiades, recalling Agathos' description of where Poe's Socratically minded angels meet to reason together and to learn from one another, thereby instructing the reader. But Israfel is a very different kind of angel, as we've seen in the poem. It's in a very significant sense. Poe, the poet, would play out and outplay the angelic archetype of poetry itself, while a bolder note than this might swell from my lyre within the sky. Poe wants to, as I say, outplay that angelic archetype. He does so in this poetically conceived universe of his own creation, and in this move, he's just following his own projection of angelic cosmic influence, and thereby continuing the pattern set in motion, according to Agathos, by the most happy, somewhere between the earth and the highest sphere, the primum mobile, namely, the outermost moving sphere in the Hellenic geocentric model of the universe. Angels in Poe's created worlds, these worlds created by words, we find out, they guard and they goad us. They sigh, these angels, and they sing. And as we saw in the Raven, these angels name. They name Lenore. Looking closely at where these angels abide is an ideal way to ask further about their place in the larger literary and ontological framework of Poe's thought. We can go on to consider why for Poe they always are more than mere reflections of good spirits, as was typical in the ideology of banal romanticism. Whether Miltonic, Islamic, or Gnostic, angels in Poe bespeak an essential and fundamental place of cosmic wonder, rooted squarely at the center of Poe's poetic imagination. To ask about the place of angels in Poe, then, is to catch a glimpse into the fiery, starry crucible of his own poetic imagination. I want to close my remarks with a passage from the domain of Arnheim. It's a work which, as Poe claims in a letter to Mrs. Sarah H. Whitman, whom he was corresponding regarding an upcoming marriage, he writes in this letter to Ms. Whitman on October 18, 1848, about the domain of Arnheim, that it expresses much of my soul. And this should be on your handout, I think, the last long passage. I'm just going to read a little bit of it toward the end, and I may have put it in bold on the handout. Admit the earthly immortality of man to have been the first intention. Sort of back to what we saw with our dialogue. We have then the primitive arrangement of the earth's surface adapted to his blissful estate as not existent but designed. The disturbances were the preparations for his subsequently conceived deathful condition. Now, said my friend, in the domain of Arnheim, what we regard as exaltation of the landscape may be really such as respects only the mortal or human point of view. And I'll read down to the end. There may be a class of beings, human once, but now invisible to humanity, to whom from afar our disorder may seem order, our unpicturesqueness, picturesque. In other words, the earth angels, for whose scrutiny more especially than our own, and for whose death-refining appreciation of the beautiful, may have been set in array by God, the wide landscape gardens of the hemispheres. Earth angels, then, for Poe, For those whose death-refined appreciation of the beautiful may have been set in array the wide landscape gardens of the hemispheres, this speaks volumes about Poe's conceptualization of the place of angels in the cosmos, as in his work and life, coming as it does from a text that he claimed expressed much of his soul. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for your presentation. And at this time, I want to introduce our next speaker. Harry Lee Poe is the Charles Colson Professor of Faith and Culture at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. Some of his publications include Evermore, Edgar Allan Poe and the Mystery of the Universe, Edgar Allan Poe, an illustrated edition, an illustrated companion to his Telltale Stories, for which he won an Edgar Award in 2009, very appropriate. See No Evil, Chance or Dance, an Evaluation of Design, Science and Faith, C.S. Lewis Remembered, and The Inklings of Oxford. He serves as president of the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond, Virginia, and is descended from Edgar Allan Poe's cousin, William Poe. Dr. Poe collects first editions, ephemera, and memorabilia related to Edgar Allan Poe, as well as the Inklings Literary Circle and their friends, especially J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Dorothy L. Sayers. And for those of you who are able to join us this afternoon for the special exhibition in the library, you will see some of the treasures from Professor Poe's collection. His talk today is Everywhere Man, Poe's Physical and Spiritual Universe. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you, Philip. It's a pleasure to be here again at MTSU, talking about Poe and his most remarkable book, Eureka, what he considered to be his magnum opus, his greatest work, and probably his least known work. Molee is about to correct that with her dissertation. Eureka, 1848. Poe delivered a lengthy lecture. It took about 3 hours to deliver his lecture. It was his lecture on the universe. And there's great confusion among Poe scholars as to what exactly this thing is. Some insist it's a prose poem, and we know it is because it says so right on the title page. Except there are 2 title pages. And the next title page says, an essay on the material and spiritual universe. So is it a lecture? Is it a prose poem? Or is it an essay? And Americans like to ask questions like that because we can render something ridiculous when in fact it's all 3. You don't choose between the options when it's all 3. And so it's a remarkable thing, but this symposium is on Poe in place. And so I'm trying to figure out that, well, the first place we start then in understanding it is the title page. So that's a place. He delivered the lecture in New York City. It was published in New York City. He told George Putnam, I'm going to need 50,000 copies of this in the first run. It is the most revolutionary book that has ever been written, and 1,000 years from now, they'll be praising me for having written it. He said, we'll do 500. The big idea in Eureka for Poe is that the universe we have is one that began with a primordial particle. The entire universe and the act of creation was one in which God created the primordial universe, and within that act of creation, all of the rest of the material universe was contained. And you have a bit of that in this dialogue between Enos and Agathos about what is meant by creation. When did the creation take place? And everything else proceeds from this initial act. So that's the beginning. Poe wasn't sure how long ago that happened. He knew it happened a long, long time ago. When I first started writing on science and religion, it was 20 billion years ago. When I published my first book on science and religion, it was 15 billion years ago. When I published my second book on science and religion, it was 14 billion years ago. When I did my third book, it was 13.5 billion years ago. And then we had the great reversal. It is now 13.7. No, that's when the editor went through it. Now it's 13.8. So, a long time ago. But Poe goes from his introduction 1,000 years into the future. Here's another place, 2848. And there, in the great distant future, he has another dialogue. He loves these dialogues between a few people who are flying around in the sky and having their tea in these vehicles that don't bother with the land at all. And they're laughing over how silly people were 1,000 years ago in their understanding of how we discover scientific truth. Poe's argument is empiricism is okay. Dogs do empiricism. Sunflowers do empiricism. I mean, it's okay. But that isn't how we discover scientific knowledge. And rationalism is good too. After all, it's rationalism that taught us that the earth is the center of the universe and the math works perfectly. And so rationalism is in its place, but it took imagination for Copernicus and Kepler to see the universe as it is. They had no new information, no new observations, yet imagination allowed them to behold what is. So imagination also allowed Poe to envision a time when we would fly everywhere. So his first science fiction story is about a trip to the moon, unfortunately in a balloon. But that was as far as his imagination took him. The Balloon-Hoax was a story he wrote in the early 1840s in which someone had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and gone, of course, to the holy city, Charleston itself. And they did so this time in a balloon shaped like a cigar with a light engine that drove a propeller, which with a rudder so that you could steer the thing. And it was a sensation. This story was a sensation. It was taken as a fact. And there was no name for this kind of story, so they called it a hoax. Today we call it science fiction. But that's what he was pioneering. Then he goes back 350 BC to critique Aristotle's deductive method. Then he goes forward to 1620 to Bacon's London, where he critiques Bacon's inductive method, before landing in Cambridge in 1687 to critique Newton's understanding of gravity. And then he rides a light beam across the universe. And this is an illustration from Eureka in which he's discussing the idea of the diffusion of light and the motion of light, the movement of light, the speed of light. And he's agreeing with a brand new idea that in the universe you don't measure distance by miles. You measure it by the speed of light and how far light travels in a year. And at this point, there's so many ideas rumbling around. As I go through the outline, what intrigues me is I can't figure out where Poe started, because all of his ideas are coming together, and it's like a geodesic dome. Once it's built, it holds itself up. But how do you get there in the first place? And the problem with a theory of everything, and this is what Stephen Hawking has been working on, people have come at it from different directions. Einstein came at it from one way. Niels Bohr came at it from another way. Hubble came at it from another way. So we've got the theory of relativity, quantum theory, the Big Bang theory. Poe is coming at it from all directions at the same time. And he says, it's like being on top of Mount Aetna and spinning around on your heel. And that's really how Eureka is put together. You've got to see all points at the same time, or you can't see the universe at all. And one thing helped Poe move along in this thought. He was always fascinated by the heavens. Notice how many references there are to the Pleiades and Orion and different star formations. He got interested in that when he was in London growing up as a boy. He lived there from 1815 to 1820. His foster father, Mr. Allen, bought a huge brass telescope. That brass telescope found its way back to Richmond when they returned. It is now at the Poe House in Baltimore. But you find his interest in the heavens reflected through all of his writings. But in 1845, Lord Rosse built his own telescope in Ireland, the largest one in the world at that point, and he began studying the heavens. And until then, the Milky Way was understood as the universe. And Lord Rosse was finding these strange formations way out that we had thought were stars. And there's his sketch of M451. That's what it looks like through the Hubble telescope. Isn't it gorgeous? Poe said, the Milky Way is not the universe. The Milky Way is one of a multitude of galaxies scattered across the heavens. Here's another one, the Pillars of Creation, a giant nebula. So Poe was fascinated with Laplace's nebular hypothesis. That is that our solar system came from this cloud of gas, spinning until at the center enough particles came together to cause nuclear fusion, and the sun burst into light and then scattered around this disk. Other little smaller places formed. That's the present theory. The earlier theory was that the sun cast out what are now the planets. Here's another one. In the midst of formation. There's another one. There's another one. But for the nebular hypothesis, in terms of places, we have to go to Immanuel Kant, who first proposed it in East Prussia in 1755, and to Laplace in Paris, who perfected it in 1796. And this is what a galaxy looks like at a distance. Amazing. And those are the ones too far away to see. He then has enough information to propose that primordial particle, what we now call the singularity, the basis for the Big Bang theory. But part of the problem with the theory of everything is the different theories don't fit together. And gravity is the big bugaboo. Electromagnetism and strong nuclear force and weak nuclear force all work, but they can't quite get gravity down. Poe said Newton was really wrong about gravity. Well, Einstein would say the same thing half century later. Poe says there are really only two forces in the universe, attraction and repulsion. And everything else is an aspect of attraction and repulsion. This is the nuclear forces as we now understand them, and they are attraction and repulsion. And this was Poe's definition of matter. Attraction and repulsion equal matter. Einstein said it energy is matter times the speed of light squared. And so in Poe's universe, you go from the subatomic particle before Madame Curie had begun doing her work and when the atom was still understood as a billiard ball. So he is working with something that does not yet have a vocabulary, just like there was no word for science fiction. And he's proposing ideas that are necessary in order for the universe to fit together. He's been doing this for over 10 years by the time he writes Eureka, but the very problem of locality, of place, there, I brought it back around to the topic. And Poe said there is no privileged place or privileged time in the universe. Einstein would come to that conclusion over 50 years later with his theory of relativity. Not only that, but we live in a universe that is uncertain. It is not the absolute universe of Laplace. Heisenberg would formulate this as Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Not only that, because of the interrelatedness of all the particles having come from one primordial particle, which is why everything works, which why billions of miles apart, is matter working the same way? It all came from the same place and spread out. Because of its interrelatedness, if a butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon jungle, there will be a typhoon in the South China Sea. He didn't state it that way, he stated it another way, but that's the way we know it now as chaos theory, which leads to the idea of indeterminacy. That is, we have an open universe, not one that is deterministic, one in which mutual adaptation, and now he's moving into the area of biology. With all of this, there is a unified force, understood as attraction and repulsion. And so all of these big ideas are going on. And for this, the public said he's lost his mind. He's absolutely crazy. And only now, at the beginning of the 21st century, do we have a situation in which we have a new universe. And does Eureka now begin to make sense? And so now Molly can write her dissertation.
And so with these two papers, we come full circle from Scott Peoples' original presentation in the fall on Poe as a nowhere man, in which he looked at Poe and his relationship to various cities in which he lived and from which he departed to make many points, one of which is that Poe is very much a part of his times and a part of these places where he lived and where he developed as a writer, where he formed relationships, but that he was always looking for home somewhere. That brought us then to the second group of papers that looked at Poe in Europe, particularly at places Poe said that he lived but didn't live, or places that are associated with Poe, but where Poe never went, or a place like France where he was accepted as a Frenchman himself and as a great world author through Charles Baudelaire. We come now finally to Poe and everywhere, Poe and the universe, and I thank both of our speakers for introducing many of us, I think, for the first time to places in Poe's mind and in his thought and in his works that we really are just now beginning to consider as seriously as we should. At this point in the program, I would like to invite our two speakers to come to the front, and I would like to introduce our respondent who will pose some questions in order to get the conversation going. Our respondent is Mo Lee. Mo Lee is a PhD candidate in English here at Middle Tennessee State University and is a member of the Post Studies Association. Her dissertation, which is in progress, is titled Awful Truth, Elusive Messengers and Unfortunate Explorers, Tracing Eureka in Edgar Allan Poe's Writings.
To start us off, I'd like to ask a question for our both wonderful speakers. So the question is this. You both talked about how Poe spent pages and pages and years on things about the mysteries and the wonders of either angelic spaces or the universe altogether. So what's the drive or what's the passion for Poe to stay so focused and so obsessed with this topic? So that's the question.
Shall I defer to you?
How thoughtful. Well, I think these were his questions.
Yes.
These are big questions, and they're related to all of his work. So one, at the end of Eureka, he tips his hand finally and says, this is how we can understand the problem of suffering or the issue of justice in a universe. Why do bad things happen? And part of his answer is, well, the story's not over yet. We're in the midst of the story. He wrote an essay on the American drama and what was wrong with American drama in the 1840s. It was just ghastly. It just all, this, depending on who was in the cast, they would figure out something for them to do and maybe play the bagpipes or, and so the scripts just went all over the place. And Poe said, you need a tight script, a tight plot in which the essentials happen, but you don't have extra things happening, but you have to have everything that has to happen to tell the story. And then he said, the universe is a plot of God. The universe is the perfect plot. And so he's beginning to think of the universe itself as a narrative. And so that deals with, for him, with questions of justice, and then questions of why is there such a thing as beauty? Why is there such a thing as love? And he'd experienced all of these. And why is there such a thing as a sense of justice? And you need to tie that in with his creation of the modern mystery story, which explores the very idea of justice. And the mystery story only works if the reader brings to the story the idea of justice, of fairness. You want to know who done it. You want the bad person to be caught, and on and on. So I think these were just the big questions he was pursuing.
And I was going to begin with some of the hardships in Poe's life as he is constantly struggling to make ends meet, to find a place to live, to provide a home for the menage of his wife and mother-in-law. And in the midst of all this, his mind is wandering to the larger scope of things. He has a wonderful text, Conversations with a Mummy, I think is how it is, who's revived. If you haven't read it, it's definitely worth a look. Again, a kind of backward looking, but it is one that deals almost exclusively with social justice and the treatment of people throughout time. And so for Poe, these are kinds of settings to ask the larger Socratic, Platonic questions, justice, life. As for things like beauty, I didn't get to read, although I'm sure y'all all can, in Al-Araf. Beauty is what it's all about, with a capital B, and how it manifests itself, not just as truth, because as we see with Poe, things are simply true, and that's what we want to understand is the kind of aesthetics of that truth. So I agree very much with Professor Poe that this is an abiding question for Poe, and it's kind of code. So much of what Poe does is cryptography. I think his universe work, Conversation with Mummies, I don't want to say a ruse or a hoax, but it's code to get at not writing like Kant, Kant and Hegel, who he makes fun of precisely for their reductive rational thinking. So he's more projective.
Thank you. Speaking of beauty and angelic beings versus earthly beings, I have a question for Dr. Engel. So what exactly could a human being, like for this life, can we have a relationship or not with angelic beings?
Right. I think,
us.
unlike Queen Elizabeth's astrologer, John Dee, who thought he could talk with angels, and some of you may have looked at that, I don't think Poe really has that kind of a metaphysics in mind, as much as one of the things that we were able to see in a few of the passages I brought out is we have these earth angels that once were human, and so it's a kind of evolutionary consciousness he's talking about. That's why I was fascinated in rereading passages getting ready for this presentation, that angels seem to age, they grow, they mature. You can see, I think he's taking that motif from Milton, where you have the stripling cherub that Milton Satan can dupe and say, which way I want to go magnify this new creation. He goes, oh, well, it's just over there, don't worry. And, but if he'd known better like Uriel, it's like, who are you? What are you doing here? So there is this sense of growing in knowledge. Again, I don't think Poe really saw angels, talked to angels. I think for Poe, angels remain I'm going to use the term advisedly because Poe would hate this word, allegorical or representational, more representational, more metaphoric ways of understanding these larger abstract concepts.
Can I play off of that? Because
Please.
you've raised several important things about that relate to modern literature that we don't usually associate with Poe. We think of him as being a pioneer in science fiction. Jules Verne called him the father of science fiction. We think of him with the creation of the detective story. We don't often think of him with fantasy. But one of the things that Bill was bringing out in his discussion of Poe's treatment of the heavenly realms, it's not quite Islam, it's not quite Christianity, it's not quite Judaism. He's making up a world. He's making up a world. And he talks about this sort of thing in a number of his, so it's not allegory. It's more mythology, I think. He's creating a world, and in some of his poetry he talks about fairyland. Now, Poe had a huge influence on a Scot named George MacDonald. And George MacDonald was hugely inspired by this kind of writing, of making up a world. And George MacDonald was a huge influence on two Oxford professors, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Now, Lewis and Tolkien weren't aware of that MacDonald-Poe connection, but it's that same line of some of the criticism of Narnia is it's not really Christian. It's make-believe, and Middle Earth, that's certainly not Christian. It's what is it? Make-believe.
Celtic.
Yeah, it's a little bit here, a little bit there, and it's a creative world.
So speaking of sources and how Poe incorporate them but don't actually stick to them, is there any kind of convention or tradition in which Poe is firmly adhering to? Or just odd question.
The tradition he adheres most to is English literature. And the so-called great classics. He had access to all of these things while he's in England. He probably read the complete Marlowe, Milton, in the schoolboy editions he had. And I would say even for his day and age, he was precocious. I think he had a better handle on the sweep of literature, certainly when he gets to Virginia, than many of his American educated colleagues.
And
Cohort.
Well, no, I think this is right. It's part of that tradition, which is yes, things that are the poets of the English tradition, but also the classics.
Absolutely.
Because he read Greek and Latin and would have read all the classics in Greek and Latin. But remember, scandal of scandals, he was a French major at the University of Virginia, and loved modern language. So this is the background. But the thing about Poe, which I think is true of all great writers, they write about what they know, but they don't really write about themselves. When you write about yourself, it's a very dull book. Very few writers have pulled off writing about themselves. The great ones are informed by one's background and what you know. And Poe was driven by the idea of being creative and innovative and doing something new. His idea of plagiarism was a much higher bar than the Academy today. If you did anything remotely like somebody else, he would charge you with plagiarism. He gave Longfellow a terrible time over that sort of thing, and that Longfellow was probably not guilty. But if somebody else had done it, then if you've done it too, it's just not to be borne. So I think he's in the Romantic tradition, but he's not a Romantic. He's in the classical tradition, but he's not a classicist.
And if I could just say one final thing, it's less an influence and more the body of knowledge he had. As we know from his experience in West Point and beyond, he was also exceedingly good at maths and engineering. So he has read all of the basic treatises on fortification building, on war, and going back, and all of that plays into it. I think with his fantasy worlds, he's an architect, he's an engineer, and let's just transplant that into literature.
That's actually my next question.
Oh,
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our speakers today and our respondents.